Okay, section 20, Karen Armstrong's anthology on the Buddha. Let's read it and then we can analyze it. Even though the truths make rational sense, the text emphasize that they did not come from Gautama by means of discursive reasoning. As he sat meditating under the Bodhi tree, they rose up in him. As from the depths of his being, he apprehended them within himself by a kind of direct knowledge acquired by a yogin who practices the disciplines of yoga with diligence, ardor, and self-control. Gautama was so absorbed by these truths, the object of his contemplation, that nothing interposed itself between them and his own mind and heart. He had become their human embodiment. When people observed the way he behaved and responded to events, they could see what the Dharma was like. They could see Nibbana in human form. In order to share Gautama's experience, we have to approach the truth in a spirit of total abandonment. We have to be prepared to leave our old unregenerate selves behind. The compassionate morality and yoga devised by Gautama only brought liberation if the aspirant was ready to lay aside all egoism. It is significant that the moment he achieved Nibbana under the Bodhi tree, Gautama did not cry, "I am liberated," but it is liberated. And he transcended himself, achieving an ecstasis, and discovered an enhanced, immeasurable dimension of his own humanity that he had not known before. Is Armstrong's use of poetry a function of her non-cognitive theory of language when she says, even though the truths make rational sense, the text emphasized they did not come to Gautama by means of discursive reasoning? Let's pick up those two things there. Theravada accepts the hagiographies of the Buddhist show, and the Pali canons largely agree that you must wait for enlightenment, not discover it through reasons. Yet perhaps Armstrong has got herself in a sort of post-Kantian knot. She wants to affirm her own autonomous reasoning, that her book is a rational book, and yet deny others have the right or the capacity to use rational sense. How does she know that Theravada, always don't use reason, don't use discursive thinking? What does it mean to say they rose up in him, and no Buddhists and can no Buddhists have the same experience? Let's underline that bit. They rose up in him. For the monk, the rising up reflects the Theravada idea that there are rewards for achieving the jhanas that can only be received passively. I think William James's 4 categories, and one is the passivity of religious experience. Each of these jhanas comes with a reward and fades, and that reward yet fades with the achievement of the next level. Armstrong would see what rises up actually is the experience of Jungian archetypes, not of supernatural experiences per se. Now, the Shramana movement included yogins that predated Buddhism, and the Buddha worked with them. And Armstrong here is suggesting, in her pluralist kind of every man, don't offend anyone interpretation of Buddhism, that Buddhism itself has no exclusive special insight. The Buddha gained nothing that others hadn't discovered before him. Other mystics who with diligence, ardor, and self-control, now Theravada would be less optimistic about being able to discover these truths if you're not listening to the way of the elders. So is Armstrong here teaching, is her teaching on the jhanas, the fetters, the rewards, as part of a kind of Samantha Vipassana meditation, or is it just some sort of positive psychology when she says direct knowledge acquired by the yogin? And Gautama was so absorbed in these truths, the object of his contemplation, that nothing interposed itself to him in his own mind and heart. It is possible that she's just confusing Buddhist theory of meditation with some sort of Jungian therapy, maybe with the idea of mental health and with mental well-being. But mental well-being doesn't equate with Buddhist, the goal of Buddhist meditation. Maybe it's positive psychology. We mentioned that here, flow, this kind of rapt attention. But flow is not, again, religious experience. And she's not being clear in what she's claiming here. So what do traditional Buddhists take refuge in? And what are Armstrong's suggested refuges? What are her 3 refuges? Let's have a think here. When she says, when people observed the way that he behaved and responded to the events, they could see what the Dharma was like. Well, can we see what Armstrong's Dharma is like? Perhaps Armstrong is reflecting on the Pali Canon when she says, anyone who sees me can see the Dharma. Maybe anyone who sees Armstrong can see Armstrong's Dharma, the pluralist, everyman Buddha, the therapeutic, psychological object that we should all imitate. This sort of Jungian psychology, this big history Dharma of a secular society, Sangha. Do you want to join? Are you with everyone else in our society trying to therapize yourself? Once you achieved mental health and perfect therapeutic balance, have you reached Nibbana? Well, she seems to think you will. Is that what Buddhists teach, though? I'm not so sure Theravada or Mahayana particulars would say that. Is Armstrong smuggling in a Christian teleology from her own past here? So when she says, we have prepared to leave our old unregenerate selves behind. That interesting phrase, unregenerate selves behind. Armstrong was a nun who was increasingly liberal in her kind of Catholic mystical teaching. And while she left behind the kind of conservative language of theology, it's very hard to leave behind the liturgy which is inculcated through practice. Hard to shake. It creates, the very language creates her thoughts. Her pluralism further means that such terms are used, but without their original context and meaning. So it's questionable how far such terms as unregenerate are helpful in understanding Buddhism given their original Christian context. But if your agenda in any case is to muddy the waters, the pluralist waters, then such a strategy probably works quite well. What then is Armstrong's soteriological view if she is projecting onto Buddhism? Let's have a look here at what she says next. Morality and yoga devised by Gautama only brought liberation if the aspirant was ready to lay aside what? All egoism. It seems Armstrong wants to avoid committing to either the goals of Theravada or the goals of Mahayana, the ideas of the goal that she wants you to put your refuge in, as it were, that the Dharma is the Freudian, Jungian laying aside of the ego. This, and so she very positively quotes, not I am liberated, but it is liberated, suggesting, I think in her mind, this sort of Jungian collective unconsciousness idea about, and maybe invoking, perhaps without enthusiasm, anatta, possibly even sunyata, laying aside sense of identity or separateness. But really, it's probably, in her thinking, egoism is a kind of Jungian category, a Freudian category. Let's read on. Is Armstrong replacing the Theravada forgotten self and the Mahayana empty self with the authentic self that is the Freudian, Jungian, therapeutic man ideal? What do we mean here? Well, let's read this bit here. Gautama did not cry, I am liberated, but it is liberated. He had transcended himself, achieved an ecstasis, and discovered he had an immeasurable dimension of his humanity that he had not known before. Philip Reif, really interesting psychologist, Jewish psychologist, uses in his book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic Uses of Faith After Freud, tracks the changes in human understanding about the self in the West from probably Aristotle's day, where in antiquity, where you were political, people defined themselves by their political involvement, to the Middle Ages, where people defined themselves by their religious involvement, to the Victorian, early modern age, where people defined themselves by being economically engaged, to our current postmodern age, where people define themselves by their therapeutic goals, by their sense of mental health and well-being. The goal of all education now is your mental health, your well-being. But that was not always the goal of being a person, being a human in the West. And it seems Armstrong here wants to buy into that and preach that message to the converted. She wants you to liberate yourself along these Freudian terms, to have a balanced id and ego and all of that stuff. Really, really interesting. So by this, lastly, this word ecstasis. Let me find a color to kind of shade it in nice red there. Let's go for red. What a great word, ecstasis. Ecstasis. Ecstasis is a reference to rapture. And I think this betrays the roots of her thinking. Romantics like Rousseau, who the Swiss thinker who wrote the book The Social Contract, who thinks everything is just a sentiment, a feeling. It's an individual thing. Through post-Kantian writers like Wordsworth, with his very individual therapeutic perspective. Through Shelley, the poetry of Shelley. Or indeed here, what she takes to be the trance-like state, that is the heights of therapeutic life, as it were. There are hints, perhaps you could argue, of Theravada in the Abhidhamma that talks about the highest levels of consciousness, 30 planes of existence and the 6 realms and so on. Or is she just Armstrong? Is she just prefer not to complicate the issue with such scholarly consideration, and she's reading in her Freudianism to Buddhism? So that's section 20.